Part 3.
Months before surrendering to the Philippine Army on March of 1950. Akatsu let U.S. and Filipino authorities know of the other men still fighting in the jungle, and the U.S. underwent a campaign to track down family members of the other three holdouts. Eventually, they obtained family photos and letters from relatives, all urging the soldiers to surrender, airdropping the messages across Lubang Island in 1952. Unfortunately, upon discovering the letters and photos, Onoda assumed that the Japanese homeland had fallen, and their loved ones were now living under American occupation, and thus forced to
share instructions for my Gatsby. My gazpacho. Mr. Henry Chicken. Mr. Doggy Boy. Mr. Trent.
and their loved ones were now living under American occupation, and thus forced to write those letters. This belief only filled Onoda and his men with great resolve to continue resisting. 2 years later, though, Corporal Shibata was shot and killed by a Filipino search party that was looking for the men, intending to arrest them and bring them to trial for the murders they had committed. For another 18 years, Onoda would continue his war, alongside Private First Class Inshichi Kazuya, clashing with police forces and farmers, until in 1972, Kozuka would be killed by police while raiding a local village. Onoda was now all alone, and still, he refused to surrender. In 1974, Japanese adventurer Norio Suzuki embarked on a trip around the world. Lieutenant Onoda had become something of a celebrity in Japan at this point, and would become entranced by the soldiers' refusal to surrender. As the highlights of Suzuki's trip, he declared that he wanted to see Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that very order. In February of that same year, Suzuki landed in Lufang Island and managed to track down Onoda, greeting him by saying, "Onoda-san, the Emperor and the people of Japan are worried about you." Suzuki informed the old soldier that the war had been over for decades, yet Onoda still said that he would not surrender until relieved of duty by a superior officer. The Japanese government quickly tracked down Onoda's surviving commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, and flew him to Lubang on March 9, 1974, at 52 years old. Onoda emerged from the jungle, still dressed in his service uniform and carrying his rifle and service sword, accepting the order from his commanding officer to at last surrender. Later, he would surrender his sword to the President of the Philippines, who granted Onoda a pardon for his many crimes. Upon returning to Japan, Onoda was hailed as a hero. Yet Onoda was deeply troubled by the Japan he returned to. He did not believe that Japan should have apologized for the war in Asia, and he was utterly dismayed to discover that the military had been dissolved by the Allies. Uncomfortable with the new liberal Japan, who wanted to distance itself from its warlike past, Onoda became involved with right-wing politics, calling for Japan to return to its former military might and become a world power again. Luckily, nobody paid much attention to Onoda. Unable to accept a peaceful, liberal Japan not under the thumb of military, Onoda eventually moved to Brazil in 1975, where he would spend most of his life. Onoda's 30-year war was an incredible, if foolhardy, act of dedication. While initially praised as a national hero and a soldier by the Japanese people and admirers around the world, Onoda's return and troubling penchant for authoritarianism saw him fall out of favor with a population thoroughly sick of war. In the end, Onoda was a relic of the past who couldn't accept the change that had gripped the world after the horrors of World War II, a change which valued international cooperation over empire building. The Vietnam War is in full swing, and back home in the USA, hordes of civilians are protesting the US's involvement in what's seen as a pointless war almost every day. The government pushes back against these protests, stating that it's important to cut off communism wherever possible before it spreads like a plague. For 12 men on patrol deep in the jungles of South Vietnam, though, none of this matters. What matters now is their own lives. It's near dusk, and the men are cautiously making their way through thick jungle back to their fire base. They're not far now, only 2 or 3 miles away, but are very wary of running into an enemy ambush. The Viet Cong and their North Vietnamese allies have taken to hitting American patrols on the way back, when the men are exhausted after hours fighting in the jungle and being eaten alive by mosquitoes and other creepy crawlies. Suddenly, a rifle opens up, and then a dozen more. The GIs hit the ground and return fire. A quick heads up reveals that no one's been hit. It's hard to see the enemy, but it's getting dark enough that the muzzle blasts reveal each shooter's position. The men must be careful to kill their target without being killed in return. In the midst of the firefight, one of the American soldiers suddenly notices a large, hulking figure, which he had assumed was a big bush, stand up and immediately flee across the battlefield. The creature is impressive, clearly at least 7 feet tall, and with a body that's pure muscle. Thick, matted fur, not fur, it's hair, covers the creature's entire body as it crosses the jungle in huge bounding steps. The American is in shock and briefly forgets all about the ongoing firefight. On the other side of the battlefield, there's an alarmed cry from the Viet Cong fighters, and the firing dies off briefly. The enemy soldiers shout a word over and over again, and suddenly one of them fires on the creature. Several American soldiers see the creature get struck by enemy fire, roar, but keep on going. The Viet Cong are in a near full panic now and begin to retreat, allowing the Americans to flee the ambush. The next morning, the American GIs relate their encounter to the commanding officer and ask for permission to investigate the ambush site. Working their way back to the battlefield, the men quickly identified the location of the firefight and where the beast was originally seen. As they searched, they made a grisly discovery. An enemy Viet Cong soldier lays dead, a frozen look of horror still on his face. The body has been mutilated, practically ripped apart, and there's not a single bullet wound on it. This encounter is not new to American forces operating out of Vietnam, though, and the locals quickly inform the soldiers that what they're encountering is a creature they have known for generations. The Batutut, Uze, or Noizung, otherwise known as the Jungle People. These creatures have been known by the locals to inhabit the deep jungles of Vietnam and Southeast Asia, exactly the places that have now been turned into battlefields. Initially, American troops quickly make allusions to Bigfoot or Sasquatch of North America. By the time of the Vietnam War, Bigfoot mania was already sweeping the United States. Tracks of a giant biped humanoid had been discovered in Northern California at a construction site a few years ago, and the tales of the elusive Sasquatch had begun to flood the media as witnesses silent for years for fear of ridicule began to come forward with their tales. Experts claim that the creature is a hoax, and that no such great ape could possibly still be living in North America without being discovered. And yet, the footprint evidence continues to pour in from all across the nation, and eyewitness accounts along with them. Strangely, the creature seems to not be uniform in size or even appearance across North America, with witnesses in the north and west of the continent describing it as having black or reddish fur, while witnesses in the south of the United States describe it as having light brown to reddish fur. What is intriguing is that the descriptions of the beast, and even the tracks photographed or collected as plaster casts, all seem to fit the general geographic description of the mystery animal. Could all these people be in on one big hoax? These rock apes, though, as the GIs begin to call them, couldn't be more different than the Sasquatch of back home. These mystery apes stand about 6 feet tall, a full foot to 2 feet shorter than the North American Bigfoot, and their fur is brown and black like a Sasquatch, but bare in the knees and the soles of the feet, hands, and the face, more akin to an orangutan or a chimpanzee. Behaviorally, they couldn't be further from the North American Bigfoot. While American Sasquatches are widely said to be gentle, even shy creatures, rarely ever act aggressively, these rock apes are highly aggressive and bold creatures, often charging straight at humans who trespass into their territory. With their powerfully muscled bodies, the result of being caught by one of these creatures is perhaps best evidenced by the sorry condition of the Viet Cong fighter the American soldiers in our opening story discovered. Much like Bigfoot, though, the rock apes are said to be active at night or at dusk, which could help to explain why they're so rarely ever seen, and why they've avoided scientific detection. Unlike Bigfoot, though, rock apes are known to travel in pairs, while Bigfoot is rarely ever spotted in a group. With a jungle full of dangers, though, it's perhaps no surprise that rock apes see a need to travel in groups. Sightings of rock apes were surprisingly common throughout fighting in Vietnam by both sides of the conflict. One NVA general became obsessed with capturing a specimen alive and even ordered a hunting party be formed, though most of the soldiers and locals were too terrified of the animal to ever approach one willingly. It would be American soldiers who nicknamed the creature the rock apes for the way that the animals would hurl back rocks thrown at them, and on several occasions even live grenades. Skeptics claimed that American troops were seeing orangutans and misidentifying them in the thick jungle, except that while orangutans did once inhabit Vietnam, they went extinct there thousands of years ago. Another candidate for the rock ape was the gibbon, which was native to Vietnam and inhabits the area in large numbers. The sheer size disparity between a rock ape standing nearly 6 feet tall and a gibbon which can weigh as much as 20 pounds, though, makes that highly unlikely. The unsettling conclusion may simply be that at least some rock ape sightings were real, and not the result of misidentification. The creatures were at least real enough and spotted often enough that one hill where they were frequently sighted ended up being called Monkey Hill by the Americans. Interestingly, the creatures were never spotted in the jungles near the coastal areas or close to civilization, and instead only in the deepest parts of the Vietnamese jungle. This perhaps explains why the animals were so fearless toward humans. Their extreme isolation in the deepest jungles would have rarely ever brought them into contact with humans, aside from the few villagers living extremely isolated lives. Seeing as prior to the war, no sizable human presence had ever entered these jungles for long, it's perhaps not surprising that combatants on both sides might have stumbled across an entirely unknown great ape species. The encounters would continue to pour in throughout the war, though, and sometimes with a very large amount of eyewitnesses. One encounter, as told by soldiers of the 101st Airborne, details an encounter between a troop of rock apes and an entire infantry platoon that was settling into a quick lunch. Apparently, the apes were suddenly spotted breaking clear of the jungle and advancing along a trail on the ridge of Nui Mo Tao, a large hill that would end up being the site of the Battle of Phu Loc. The American infantry immediately thought the figures were Viet Cong and opened fire with M16s, machine guns, and even grenade launchers. The figures quickly fled into the jungle. Unlike a normal animal, though, these rock apes appeared to rush through the trees, almost as if waiting for a break in the gunfire to charge the American troops, even stepping out briefly to howl and flash huge fanged teeth at them. The creatures also let loose with howls and barks, much like angry dogs, a behavior that's common to many apes and even attributed to the North American Sasquatch. Eventually, the soldiers realized they were not firing at people, and
Well, I'm gonna finish the episode at least.
ceased their fire, and as the animals retreated, they searched the area but found no bodies. Another incredible account relates to the story of a full-blown battle between rock apes and American Marines, taking place on Hill 868 in Quang Nam Province. The battle began with a unit of Marines deep in the jungle radioing back to their HQ that they'd spotted movement in the jungle near their position. The Marines, likely a patrol made up of around 30 men total, were told to hold their position and not give themselves away. Simply observe the enemy's movements and radio back. After a few minutes, the Marines nervously radioed back, stating that they'd been surrounded by what looked like hairy bipedal humanoid creatures. Likely assuming the creatures were nothing more than the gibbons so common in the area, the Marines were told to simply toss rocks at them in order to scare them away. Upon throwing rocks, though, the creatures became enraged and began tossing rocks back at the men. Suddenly, what sounded like a pitched battle was heard over the radio, complete with men yelling, inhuman screams, and the sounds of gunfire. A patrol sent to reinforce the Marine unit discovered a battlefield littered with several corpses of rock apes, along with many injured Marines. This account, however, relies entirely on eyewitness testimony, as no evidence of these rock apes was ever recovered. The veracity of this particular tale is in serious question. Though, given the nature of the fighting in Vietnam, it may come as no surprise that nobody took the time to try and recover a body. Still, such a stunning incident should come with more hard evidence than scattered eyewitness testimony. And for us, we're willing to file this story away as a possible tall tale. Hard evidence for the rock ape wouldn't appear until 1974, a year before the end of the Vietnam War. With both sides reporting the existence of the creature, Professor Va Quy of Vietnam National University decided to lead a North Vietnamese expedition into the jungle to search for it. While he never discovered a real rock ape, he did photograph and make plaster prints of extremely curious tracks. The tracks were said by locals to have been formed by the Batutut, a creature that they'd shared stories of for generations. Curiously, the print, much like many Bigfoot prints, shows features that are strikingly similar to apes, while being much larger than that of any known ape. As had been said of many Bigfoot prints thought to be authentic, if these were hoaxed, then they would have been hoaxed by someone with detailed knowledge of ape physiology. Sightings of the rock ape continue to this day, and though no hard evidence has been gathered, perhaps the best evidence for the existence of these creatures is the sheer amount of reported sightings. Then there's also the fact that these are creatures believed to be real flesh and blood animals by locals. jungles, rather than mythical spirits or animals of legend. Skeptics point to a lack of remains or physical evidence as reason to doubt its existence. And yet, these are the same skeptics who were also stunned in the early 1990s by the discovery of the saola, an animal described as an Asian unicorn. The saola was spoken of by natives for generations too, and yet science denied its existence until a body was finally found in 1992. Since then, the animal has been officially classified and is considered one of the rarest mammals in the world. Perhaps if a large mammal like the saola can lurk in the deepest jungles undiscovered for thousands of years, then so too can an equally rare and terrifying beast such as the Vietnamese yeti, the legendary rock ape. Arthur Wehrmuth crawled through the mud of the Philippine jungle. He paused to let a squad of Japanese soldiers march past. Once he was in the clear, Wehrmuth continued to stealthily make his way through enemy territory. He spotted a small hill that overlooked an enemy camp. Wehrmuth made his way to the ridgeline and took aim at the Japanese soldiers below, then unleashed a rain of lead from his Thompson submachine gun. The confused soldiers shouted, "How did American troops get behind us?" What they didn't know was that the Americans causing so much chaos and destruction was actually only...
Running your business can feel like a jungle, overwhelming and scary. But you just need the right tool. Odoo is the best software to run any kind of business efficiently. Through a sea of tasks, overwhelming paperwork, and never-ending spreadsheets. Whatever your business is, Odoo saves time to focus on what you really love doing. Book your demo at odoo.com.
One man. A man who would later be called the One-Man Army of Bataan. Arthur Wehrmuth was assigned to Company D of the 57th Infantry during World War II. What made this squad unique was that it consisted of mostly Filipino soldiers. A small group of American soldiers, including Wehrmuth, was attached to the 57th Infantry. The squad itself was nicknamed the Filipino Scouts, as their main mission was reconnaissance and infiltration behind enemy lines. Sent to the Philippines in 1941, it didn't take long before Wehrmuth was promoted to the rank of captain of the Filipino Scouts. As the much larger Japanese force pressed forward, Wehrmuth and his men repelled attack after attack. They were heavily outnumbered and outgunned, but with Wehrmuth's leadership they caused numerous setbacks for the Japanese army. In January of 1942, the Japanese launched an offensive against the Allied forces. It seemed that the American and Filipino soldiers would be overrun and the islands would be lost. But Wehrmuth had other plans. He grabbed his Thompson submachine gun, 2 .45 caliber pistols, and as many grenades as he could carry. He covered his skin in dirt and camouflaged his helmet with foliage. Wehrmuth snuck across enemy lines and hid in the dense jungle. He waited for a Japanese patrol to pass by. Eventually, a heavily armed squad crossed his path. He was so well hidden that one of these soldiers almost stepped on him. The enemy squad was heading toward the Allied lines. Wehrmuth knew that if he stayed with the squad, he would be able to surprise them from behind once they were engaged with the Allied forces. As the last Japanese soldier passed, Wehrmuth stepped to the end of the line and followed the Japanese soldiers as if he were one of their own. They proceeded miles through the dark jungle, the Japanese unaware that Wehrmuth had infiltrated their ranks. When the soldier in front of him made too much noise, Wehrmuth shushed him. The Japanese squad neared the fortified position of the Philippine scouts. Wehrmuth did not want to get caught in the crossfire from his own soldiers, so he decided it was time to get away, but not before causing a little chaos. Wehrmuth purposefully stumbled into the soldier directly in front of him. As he pretended to grab onto the man for support, he handed him a live grenade. Wehrmuth gave the enemy soldier a shove and then dove into the protection of the jungle. The Philippine scouts could hear screams from in front of them. All of a sudden, the grenade went off, taking enemy soldiers with it. More importantly, the explosion gave away the position of the Japanese squad. The Philippine scouts, with the help of Wehrmuth from behind, made quick work of the enemy troops. It was acts of courage and destruction like this that earned Wehrmuth the Japanese title, the Ghost of Bataan, a name that he rightfully deserved, as each one of his adventures behind enemy lines got crazier and crazier. Although Wehrmuth was a one-man army and could cause mayhem by himself, he often worked with his close friend and brother-in-arms, Jock. Jock was a massive 6'4", 220-pound Filipino soldier. As they fought together, they quickly became friends who always had each other's backs. Wehrmuth liked working alone, but Jock was adamant he'd go with his captain as backup whenever Wehrmuth volunteered for a dangerous mission. Jock saved Wehrmuth's life on more than one occasion. The most notable time this happened was on a mission to uncover a Japanese tap into the Allied communication systems. This mission mission was so astounding that a portrayal of it would end up in wartime gum packages back in the United States. It had become obvious that the Japanese were able to tap into the Allied communication lines. They seemed to know too much about Allied movements and plans. The commanders asked for volunteers to scout the wires along the front lines to find and disrupt the Japanese wiretap. Wehrmuth was the first to volunteer. Jock immediately stepped forward to join his captain. They set out together to locate and dismantle the deadly problem. The two men made their way through the damp jungle. They had to dodge poisonous snakes, deadly spiders, and the watchful eyes of Japanese snipers. They searched and searched for the wiretap, but came up empty-handed. Wehrmuth and Jock started to make their way back to the Allied defensive position. On their return journey, Wehrmuth got tangled in what seemed like a vine at first. He tripped and landed in the mud. As he went to cut the vine, he noticed that it wasn't a vine at all. It was a wire. Wehrmuth and Jock followed the wire. Suddenly, Wehrmuth fell into a camouflage ditch, landing directly on top of a shocked Japanese soldier who was tapped into Allied transmissions. Wehrmuth pushed off the enemy soldier and drew his pistol like a cowboy in an old Western movie. He fired and killed the Japanese soldier who was too slow to draw. Wehrmuth slowly made his way to the recording equipment to get a better look at how the Japanese had tapped into the Allied communication system. He was so fascinated by the technology that he did not notice two other Japanese soldiers who had crept up on him from behind. The sound of a branch snapping behind him caught his attention. Wehrmuth spun around, but this time he drew his gun too slowly. One of the Japanese soldiers plunged a bayonet into his arm. The rusty metal scraped along his bone and pinned him to a wall. Wehrmuth knew he was in big trouble. There was only one person who could save him. He called out for Jock. "Japanese! 2 more down here!" he yelled. Jock raced to where his captain had fallen into the ditch. Without hesitating, Jock jumped into the hole. He landed hard on the ground below. When Jock looked up, Wehrmuth was struggling in hand-to-hand combat with the Japanese soldiers. Jock pushed off the ground and launched his huge body toward the assailants. He used the butt of his rifle to bludgeon one enemy unconscious. Jock next turned to the second enemy. He shoved him away from Wehrmuth and shot the remaining Japanese soldier. After the threat had been dealt with, Jock ran over to Wehrmuth to tend to his wounds. His captain had nearly passed out from the pain in his arm and loss of blood. Jock carefully removed the bayonet and bandaged the wound. He threw Wehrmuth across his soldiers and carried him back to the safety of the Allied base. If it weren't for Jock, the one-man army of Bataan might have died in that Japanese ditch. This story and the exploits of Wehrmuth made it back to the U.S. He was seen as a living war hero. The successful mission of finding and dismantling the Japanese wiretap by Wehrmuth and Jock made headlines. It was so well known that a drawing of the mission was placed in the wrappers of wartime gum to help fund the war effort. Wehrmuth spent a lot of time in and out of the hospital. He would get patched up, and even before the doctor gave him the all-clear, he would ask to be sent back to his squad. His next exploit was so insane, you won't believe how he managed to get out of it alive. Allied headquarters had determined the only way to disrupt the Japanese advance was to destroy a bridge that allowed them easy access into the area surrounding Manila. There was only one bridge in the area, but it was deep behind enemy lines. Someone needed to sneak far into Japanese-held territory and blow up the bridge. Otherwise, Allied forces would quickly be overwhelmed. Arthur Wehrmuth volunteered for the job. He set out just before dawn when the sun was low in the sky. Most of the Japanese soldiers were still asleep at the time. Wehrmuth carried the 2 5-gallon drums of gasoline with him to create a distraction before he blew the bridge up. He made his way into the town of Calagiman, which is where the bridge was located. He stuck to the shadows of alleyways to keep out of the sight of enemy snipers and guards. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers inhabited the town. It was a main hub for transporting supplies. The plan was that once Wehrmuth set fire to the town, the Allied artillery would unleash a barrage of shells on Calagiman. This would serve as a distraction so that Wehrmuth could make his way to the bridge and detonate the TNT to destroy it. He snuck to the far end of the town and began spraying gasoline onto the walls of the thatched roof buildings. He struck a match, set the buildings ablaze, and waited for the chaos to ensue. Japanese soldiers ran out of the burning buildings on fire and screaming. They rolled on the dirt ground to put out the flames as artillery shells began falling from the sky. Wehrmuth made his way to the bridge. He tried his best to stay in the shadows, but he was running out of time. He made a break for the bridge, running up one of the main streets. Wehrmuth was spotted by the enemy soldiers who began shooting at him. He dodged fire in the streets, ducked under the flying bullets, and dove for cover. He caught his breath and began running toward the bridge again. He was almost there when a stray bullet ripped through his leg. The pain was immense, but Wehrmuth ignored it and sprinted to his target. He placed the charges while providing his own cover using his Thompson submachine gun. He blew up the bridge successfully and disappeared into the jungle. Upon returning to the Allied headquarters, he was debriefed and sent to the hospital where the bullet was removed from his calf. This was when Wehrmuth received his first of several Purple Hearts. After the surgery, Wehrmuth had no choice but to wait in the hospital until his leg healed. However, as soon as he felt strong enough, he discharged himself and returned to the front lines to join his squad. He continued to lead his men with bravery until March of 1942, when Wehrmuth and his Philippine scouts were ordered to recapture Mount Pukat from the Japanese. This was a suicide mission. The Wehrmuth was not going to disobey orders, and he would do everything he could to take the high ground. It would be an uphill battle that would nearly cost the one-man army of Bataan his life. As the squad moved up through the jungle, they were ambushed. One of the enemy soldiers rushed toward Wehrmuth, trying to stab him with a bayonet. Wehrmuth dodged the attack and wrestled the Japanese soldier to the ground. He pulled his knife and plunged it into the enemy. The Philippine scouts fought off ambush after ambush, losing men in the process. They dealt heavy losses to the Japanese forces as they pushed forward, but the cost was great. As they fought up the mountain, bullets ripped through the jungle trees and into the squad. There was a Japanese machine gun dug in across a stream. There was no way for Wehrmuth and the Philippine scouts to move forward without destroying the machine gun first. Wehrmuth mustered his bravery and led the squad in a daring counterattack. He pulled the safety ring out of a grenade and tossed it at the machine gunner. As the grenade left his hand, Wehrmuth was struck in the chest by a bullet. The bullet chipped a rib before passing through his lung. Members of his squad grabbed their captain and pulled him to safety. They retreated back to base to get Wehrmuth to a hospital. This wound was the worst one yet. The doctors told Wehrmuth he was done fighting and needed to stay in the hospital. But Wehrmuth knew his brothers were still out there trying to take the high ground. He would not abandon them. Wehrmuth was in the hospital for about a week until he could wait no longer. Against doctors' orders and with pus oozing out of his wound, he made his way back to the Philippine scouts, but it was too late. The Japanese forces were pushing the squad back. Wehrmuth was too weak to sneak behind enemy lines and ambush them like he had done so many times before. He called for a retreat. As the squad made their way back down the mountain, Wehrmuth slipped and tumbled down a ravine, slamming his head on a jagged rock below. He was knocked unconscious and had to be carried back to the hospital by his squad mates. This would be the end of the reign of the one-man army of Bataan. While in the hospital, the Japanese defeated the Allied forces in the area and took all who remained captive. But his fight to survive was not yet over. Wehrmuth was so wounded that he was unable to be sent into the Bataan Death March, where around 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were marched 70 miles to a POW camp. Thousands of soldiers were forced on the trek and died en route to the prison. Once he recovered, Wehrmuth was sent to work on building a runway for Japanese aircraft to land. He and the other men working on the project sabotaged it so the runway buckled under the weight of landing bombers and damaged them. He was then put on the Hell ship, Oryoku Maru, as one of 1,620 prisoners. This ship was bombed on December 15, 1944 by aircraft from the USS Hornet. The American ship thought the Oryoku Maru was carrying enemy troops, not prisoners of war. The mistake cost the lives of several hundred POWs, but Wehrmuth survived this ordeal as well. Eventually, Wehrmuth was imprisoned in Mukden, Korea, where his prison camp was finally liberated by Soviet forces in August 1945. When he was returned to the American military, he weighed almost 80 pounds lighter than at the beginning of the war. Wehrmuth was finally going home, where he would receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions in the Philippines. He had become a household name in the United States as a war hero, affectionately called the one-man army of Bataan by newspapers and civilians alike. Arthur Wehrmuth was credited with over 116 kills, received the Silver Star, and 3 Purple Heart medals. Modern Western civilization can trace its roots to ancient Greece, with the foundations for military and government systems drawn from 2 of the most legendary city-states to ever exist, Athens and Sparta. Athens would inspire Western civilization to rule fairly and espouse democratic ideals, while Sparta would form the backbone of military traditions meant to defend that democracy. Well, what was life really like in ancient Sparta? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're asking, what was life like for a Spartan warrior? Spartan society was, well, Spartan. It was a civilization that eschewed luxury and comfort in favor for discipline, precision, and obedience. Its men and women were wholly dedicated to the Spartan military, with almost the entirety of their efforts spent every day in supporting or strengthening Sparta's ability to wage war. Spartan citizens weren't even allowed to engage in trading, and coins were outlawed. Every free citizen was equal. There was no gender or wealth gap, as engaging in trade or even making clothing and farming was seen as as work only fit for slaves to do. There was no 1% as there was no interest in amassing wealth. Sadly, there was also little interest in the arts, science, or philosophy, unless it served the military. A Spartan soldier's life began at birth, with the child inspected and discarded if found to be physically or mentally handicapped in any way. When a child reached age 5, they would be inspected once more and killed if found to be too unhealthy. Sparta had no room for the weak. At age 7, male children were taken to a local agoge, a sort of military academy boot camp. From that moment on, a Spartan child no longer belonged to his parents, but rather to the state as a whole. At the agoge, Spartan children were purposefully underfed and encouraged to steal food, only to be severely beaten if they were caught. But not because stealing was wrong, but because they were in fact caught. This was meant to teach them to be stealthy and crafty, but also to endure hunger, as they may have to in the midst of a long campaign. You didn't have to be caught doing anything wrong in order to earn a beating, though, as part of a Spartan child's training in becoming a soldier included routine and random beatings meant to ensure they grew up tough. Living in groups under the tutelage of an older man, boys were encouraged to fight amongst themselves to determine who was the strongest, although they were strictly taught to never fight each other in anger or hold grudges. This too was purely pragmatic, rather than philosophical, as it ensured that morale stayed good amongst soldiers fighting side by side. Spartan children were not given beds to sleep on, but instead had to make their own from tough reeds pulled from riverbanks by hand, and forget about sheets or blankets. At age 12, they were given only a single item of clothing a year, a red cloak, and would not earn shoes until graduating into military service, going barefoot even in the middle of winter. This would prepare Spartan soldiers for the reality of life on the campaign trail, as Spartans did not carry sleeping cots, tents, or even blankets with them as they marched, sleeping on the ground itself wrapped only in their clothes. At age 12, a Spartan child was put under the tutelage of an older soldier in a sort of mentor relationship. Although many Greeks often made claims about pederasty in Spartan society, this one-on-one relationship was meant to pass on knowledge and experience, as well as build loyalty between soldiers and from the young child to the state. At age 18, a Spartan youth would then be initiated into adulthood through a practice called the Crypteia, a ritual seen as barbaric and brutal by the rest of the civilized world. During the Crypteia, Spartan teenagers formed into small groups and were tasked with murdering a number of slaves. Sometimes blades were provided, other times they were left to fend for themselves and improvise weapons or murder with their bare hands. The teenagers would then look for the largest and strongest of slaves and ambush the slave when unawares. Weak slaves or female slaves were rarely targeted, as they were not seen as a great threat, and thus it was the biggest and strongest who were at risk of being murdered. Though participants in a Crypteia to be punished with beatings if caught, the beatings were punishment not for the murder, but for actually being caught. Slaves had no rights or protections, and in fact, every year the ruling Spartan body would declare war on their slaves, so their murder was not seen as a murder, but rather as a casualty in an ongoing war. Considering that Spartans relied completely on their slaves for everything from sewing their clothes to trading with the other city-states, it may seem insane that murder of their own slaves was encouraged and even mandated, but for all their warrior might, Spartans lived in constant fear of their slave population. Outnumbering a normal Spartans 7-1, Spartans were all too aware that a revolt could be devastating to the city-state, and in fact, it very nearly ended a Spartan rule around 490 BC, when slaves revolted and nearly overthrew the Spartan government. From that day on, Spartans kept a very tight leash on their slaves, and once even put wreaths on the heads of 2,000 of their strongest slaves, and promised them their freedom only to lead them away to a temple and slaughter them all. At age 20, Spartans officially became part of the army, but they were not allowed to marry and live together in barracks until the age of 30. During this time, they also competed fiercely with each other for entry into the Spartan Hippeis, a royal guard of honor, of which only 300 of the best warriors would be chosen to accompany the king. Also at age 20, Spartans were voted into one of several public messes, with votes cast by members of those messes. Think of it as pledging to a fraternity the way college students do today, only with far less partying and drinking, as most Spartans did not drink alcohol and were warned against it from childhood. For Spartans, alcohol and any other substance that incapacitated you was seen as building weakness, and slaves would often be forced to get drunk on alcohol and then be publicly humiliated so that Spartan children could see the dangers of drinking. Votes for entry into a mess had to be unanimous, and this would build a strong camaraderie between the members of that mess and ensure cohesiveness in battle. Spartans had until the age of 30 to gain entry into a mess, after which if they still had not gained entry, they would be denied full Spartan citizenship. conscription, which meant they were not allowed to vote or hold office. Upon joining the army at age 20, Spartans drilled day and night in battle formations. Spartan armies made the use of the dreaded phalanx formation, in which rows of soldiers would be stacked one after the other, with each soldier's shield protecting the right flank of the man next to him. This created an impenetrable wall of bronze bristling with spear points that was nearly impossible to defeat as long as it held its cohesiveness. Yet, as powerful as the phalanx was, if this split failed for even a second and the army forced an opening, the entire formation would shatter, leaving soldiers vulnerable and exposed. This, in essence, was the entire point of Spartan training. The phalanx must never break, and in fact, Spartan phalanxes hardly ever did. With row after row of soldiers, each Spartan would push his shield into the back of the man in front of him, pushing the entire formation forward and pressing into the enemy. Those on the first 3 or 4 ranks would stab out with their spears or hurl them at the enemy, and if injured or cut down, the man behind him would immediately take their place. A living tank of bronze, leather, and human muscle. The Greek phalanx was a thing to be greatly feared, as the Persians would learn, and few were more formidable than those made up of Spartan men. Spartan society revolved entirely around their military might, and their adult life from ages 7 to 60 was devoted entirely to training and fighting. While not at war, Spartans spent every waking moment training and drilling, honing themselves for future battles. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch commented that for Spartans, war was seen as almost a holiday, saying their bodily exercises were less rigorous during their campaigns, and they were allowed a regimen less rigid. They were the only men in the world for whom war brought a respite in the training for war, yet brutally overseeing a population of slaves that outnumbered them greatly and routinely rebelled against them. It's perhaps little wonder that Spartans dedicated themselves wholly to fighting. In the end, though, this myopic focus on fighting would lead to Spartans influencing the military traditions of the modern Western world, but it would be their hated rivals, Athens, who would truly be the shining beacon of philosophy, science, and democracy that built a brighter future for mankind.
Do you think you've got what it takes to be a soldier? Today we are going to look at the life of soldiers. In this episode of the infographic show, American soldier versus British soldier. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. There are many different types of military service, with the most renowned arguably being the Army. If you join the military, you could also end up working in the other main branches, which are the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, or even as a reserve. There are many more things you can do that make you a military man or woman, so to not complicate matters too much, we will discuss the American and British armies today. We'll start with how you get into the Army and what it takes to do so. The American Army is the largest and oldest branch of the U.S. military. It was founded in 1775 to fight the British during the American Revolution. It's now one of the largest and certainly most powerful armies in the world, with a total number of personnel of just under 1 million. The Brits may have been fighting their battles for many centuries, but the British Army was only formally established in 1660. Prior to this, the English Army was the strongest military force in the region we now call the British Isles. Notwithstanding the British Army's successes and how it helped to forge an empire, the present British Army is quite small, with around 112,000 personnel. So how do you become a soldier in one of these armies? In the US, you must be between the ages of 18 and 35, although if your mother or father gives you consent, you can join at the age of 17. You should probably have a high school diploma, although most military websites do say that exceptions can be made, especially if you have passed a general educational development test. They ask you not to have more than 2
Or a
dependents, and
GED,
you must pass a medical exam and physical tests. They also require that you pass the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Test. We looked at example test questions online, and it seems you must know some basic English vocabulary and grammar, as well as have a fairly basic understanding of math, science, and mechanics. Do you know the meaning of the word observe, or where the coolant flows in a car? If you do, you are partway there. Once all that is done with, you can start your 10 weeks of basic combat training, commonly referred to as boot camp. If you want to join the regular British Army, you can do so at the age of 16 without any kind of qualifications. Remember that Brits can leave school at 15 if they don't or can't take A-levels. This might be a reason why the BBC reported in 2013 that 39% of new recruits to the British Army have a reading age of 11. On the other hand, to join the Officers Corps, you need some qualifications. The Army states that you can start the application process before you are 16, although if you actually join before the age of 18, you still need your parents' consent. You cannot apply if you are older than 33. The Army recruitment site says even criminal convictions won't stop you getting in. As it states, Army life is a great way to make a fresh start. You'll be given some medical tests and also have to prove you are fit. One such fitness test is to run 1.5 miles in less than 10 minutes 30 seconds, or 12 minutes 45 seconds for females. You'll also have to do 44 push-ups in less than 2 minutes. Females only have to do 21. Once that is done, you will join a 20 to 40 week boot camp to learn basic skills and see what area you might specialize in. Once you are in, what can you expect? In the U.S. Army, you'll receive healthcare, food allowance, housing, and pay. You might also also be paid more depending on where you are deployed. Wage depends on your rank, but if you've just started out, you'll get a basic salary of just less than $2,000 a month as well as housing benefits. After 2 years of service, this goes up, and if you are deployed somewhere like Afghanistan, you can receive extra deployment pay of $250 a month for separation from family, $150 hazard pay, and $225 for being in the line of fire and in imminent danger. British Army newbies during their long training stage will get as much as $24,890 a year. Once you are trained, you'll begin a series of steps from lieutenant to second lieutenant and earn between $33,297 and $42,669 for a number of years. A downside for British troops is that they don't seem to be paid extra for hazards and getting shot at. In fact, according to recent articles in the media, given they often work 16 hours a day, their wage ends up being less than the hourly British minimum wage. In the UK and the US Army, if you stay longer than 5 years, your rank and salary will improve greatly if you're doing a good job. Once you have decades under your belt, you might achieve colonel, and in both armies, the pay is good. A US colonel with less than 2 years in the position will receive about $91,000 a year, including benefits, while the British colonel, just after promotion to the position, will receive $109,855 a year. Brits receive a total of 6 weeks paid vacation time a year, which includes public holidays, while US soldiers receive 30 days a year, providing they work to the full year. They also get public holidays. This amounts to about the same as a British soldier. Retirement benefits are a little confusing, as it depends on how long you have been a soldier. In the US, if you work 20 years in the Army, you'll receive 50% of the last pay packet you receive. So if you earn $70,000, you'll get around $35,000 per year for the rest of your life. If you decide to stay on each year, the 50% will go up by 2.5%. In the UK, you can wait until 55 to collect your pension, or also opt to leave the service after 35 years and collect 50% of final pensionable pay. Soldiers can also opt to pay into different pension schemes. A very important matter is life on the job, and certainly if you are working in a dangerous area. The latest statistics, according to the U.S. Department of Defense Casualty Report, says that the war on terror claimed the lives of 2,350 in and around Afghanistan from 2001 to 2015. 20,092 soldiers were injured. 40 U.S. deaths and 183 wounded followed in later campaigns in the same areas. What the government called freeing Iraq amounted to 4,424 U.S. deaths and 31,900.
Why is my Thompson on semi? That distracted the
Iraq have
fuck out
claimed
of me.
hundreds more lives.
I could've
Far
killed
fewer
him if it
British
wasn't.
soldiers lost their lives in the Iraq invasion, with the number reported at 179. Less than 500 were killed in Afghanistan. In fact, The Economist reports that since 1945, a total of 7,186 British soldiers' lives have been lost around the globe. The U.S. number is over 100,000 since the same date. Another thing we should mention is the effect being a soldier might have on the mind. Reports state that U.S. soldiers are 7 times more likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder than UK soldiers, a condition that has been well documented in books and documentaries. Experts suggest that this is cultural, and certain cultures deal with stress and trauma in different ways. Apparently, the British stiff upper lip plays a part here, and it seems American soldiers express their grief, while the Brits bottle it up, even turn to the bottle. Speaking about British soldiers, after working with them in the Middle East, one American troop is quoted as saying, "Most Brits are a strange old race. They show affection by abusing each other, will think nothing of casually stopping in the middle of a firefight for their brew up, and eat food that I wouldn't give to a dying dog." He also said he'd prefer to fight alongside those troops than any other country's soldiers. The reason, he said, was that when the chips are down and there is no hope left, they just soldier on. This sounds nice and is quoted all over the internet, but we can't confirm the original source or its veracity. The British Army Special Air Force, aka SAS, began operations in 1941 during the Second World War. The reason for having such a specialized set of soldiers was to get behind enemy lines and attack them from within, or at least destroy what they could while gaining intelligence. It still takes part in operations that involve the United Kingdom, but as it's very much a covert special forces unit, much of what the SAS does is a secret. The Navy SEALs, Sea, Air, and Land Team, was formed much later when President John F. Kennedy established them in 1962 as a clandestine unit which, like the SAS, would take on special missions much of the time in very hostile environments. They also act under a veil of secrecy and are sometimes referred to as America's Secret Warriors. If both these units are so secretive, then how does one get a job with them? Well, with the SAS, there is a small problem to begin with if you are a mere civilian. They won't allow you to apply. So to start with, you must already be in the British Armed Forces or be a soldier in the British Commonwealth. Another way to get in is to join the SAS Reserves, and they do accept civilians. As long as you've passed the reserve training and worked with them at least 18 months, you can apply to work in the SAS proper. To apply for the SAS, you should be between 18 and 32 years of age and be in amazing physical and mental shape. You'll be required to do at least a 3-year stretch. Women can apply, but have so far been excluded from most combat movements. To apply, you must accept that you know the harsh demands expected of you, people have died during training, and that means signing an Army General Administrative Instruction form. You're basically acknowledging you are willing to go through hell. Next comes the medical, the battle fitness test, which will mean running fully kitted or squatted for 1.5 miles in 15 minutes. Apparently 10% of applicants don't even make it past this point. That pace for even an average person in running shoes and shorts isn't too bad. Now you start your real training. To join the Navy SEALs, you need to be a natural-born or naturalized American between the ages of 18 and 28, although at 17 you can join if your parents say it's okay. If you want to become an officer, you can be up to the age of 33. The first woman ever started the training in 2017, but dropped out soon after. You'll need to have a clean record, and many background checks will be done. You'll then undergo physical and mental tests, including an eye test to make sure you have under 20/70 vision. As for what shape you must be in, well, you are going to go through hell with the SEALs, so they suggest you follow their Navy Special Warfare Physical Training Guide. This includes lots of long and short swims and runs, lots of interval training, as well as other workouts. As for other strength training, their gym workouts basically tell you you'll have to be as strong as a bull as well as have all the cardio attributes. You'll be screened before you can start training, and that will mean you must show that you can run 1.5 miles in 11 minutes, but not squatted. This also comes after a 500-yard swim in 12.5 minutes, 42 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, and 6 pull-ups, all with a short rest in between. Once you actually start training with the SAS, the first phase lasts 4 weeks. This will test your endurance and ability to navigate through the wilderness, that being a harsh mountain range in Wales. In 2015, a young recruit died during this exercise just half a kilometer from the end. He died at the part nicknamed VW Valley, standing for Voluntary Withdrawal Valley. 2 other soldiers died that day too, leading to an inquest into the treatment of soldiers. Some of the activities in the mountains included a 15-mile hike to start with. Those that can get through that then have to do a 40-mile hike carrying a 55-pound backpack, a rifle, plus their food and water. They are not allowed to use any established trails, but they do have a map and a compass. After that, they can rest a bit and start the weapons training phase, as well as do parachute training. After that, there is 6 weeks of jungle training, usually in the rainforests of Belize, Borneo, or Brunei. The last phase is called escape and evasion, which will mean being forced into some horrible survival scenarios, as well as learning how to handle being interrogated. This will include humiliations and other psychological harassment, as well as being blindfolded, deprived of sleep, given nothing to eat or drink, being put in stress positions, imprisoned in a small cage, and having to listen to loud noises all the time. SAS tough guy turned novelist said physical injuries finish a lot of people off during training, but you need a lot of strength and will to get through the psychological stuff. In 2016, the Washington Times reported that 1 Navy SEAL died in 3 out of the last 4 training classes. One was a drowning, another a suicide, and another a car crash after drinking heavily. The Post states that the 6-month training will include a 7-day stretch of little sleep, self-induced hypothermia, and brutal physical conditioning known as Hell Week. It's Hell Week where most recruits drop out. The training in Colorado starts with 5 weeks of pre-training in class. Get through that and you enter the realm of pain and indignity. The Navy SEALs website doesn't go into specifics, but states that you'll be tested to your limits of fatigue. This will include running through sand, swimming in oceans, sometimes in the middle of the night with your clothes on, rappelling down cliffs or buildings at speed, enduring cold and heat, getting lost and finding ways out, combat training, long-distance underwater dives, weapons and explosives training, mission planning, tactics training, and more. Hell Week seems to be the worst part. One soldier described it as being designed to put you through 24/7 days of no rest and continual harassment. From his class of 300, only 19 completed the training. In all, it will last 5.5 days, and you'll almost continuously be pushed to your limits. You are allowed no more than about 4 hours sleep during the entire training. You'll also have to deal with integration in what's called the survival, evasion, resistance, and escape phase. Former SEAL Brandon Webb said it will involve sacks over your head, being beaten with sticks, and humiliation. It's here, he said, that some people lose their minds. At least after that, you get some classroom time. For 7 weeks, you'll also have a land warfare phase, as well as parachute training. If you pass it all, you'll be given the Navy SEAL Trident, but then have to do advanced training. This will include sniper, communications, and free fall parachute training. Once you are done, you'll have way more weapons to use than a regular soldier. In the SAS, this will include a C8 carbine assault rifle, an ultra-compact individual weapon, an M16, an HK MP5 submachine gun, an HK 417 sniper rifle, an AW-50 anti-material rifle, handguns, tear gas, canister launchers, stun grenades, rocket launchers, portable anti-personnel anti-personnel mines, grenade launchers, surface-to-air missiles, and many more things it will take too much time to talk about. You'll also, of course, get all the kit, including things like body armor. According to the Navy SEALs website, your regular SEAL on land will carry such things as the Colt Automatic Rifle 15, the M60 machine gun, M203 grenade launchers, a shotgun, an SASR 50 caliber sniper rifle, an M107 anti-material rifle, a Beretta M9 handgun, a 20mm Gatling gun, and AT-4 rockets. Again, these are just some of the most used weapons, as the list is endless.
January 26, 1991. Night. The Iraqi desert. Two SUVs barrel across the moon-bright desert toward Chris. Crouches low, getting into position. His body shakes from the wild pounding of his heart. He breathes deep and thinks of his 2-year-old daughter. His hand steadies. The vehicles are closer now, 55 yards away. Then 40 yards, 30 yards. At 20 yards, he pulls the trigger. A rocket whooshes from the launcher. The first SUV explodes with a heavy bang. Thick smoke billowing up. Chris launches a grenade at the second SUV, nailing its hood. Then he pops up and charges toward the vehicles, spraying bullets in case there's anyone still alive in the wreckage. Satisfied that he won't be chased anymore, Chris turns and runs until it feels like his heart is going to burst. For now, he's escaped the enemy. He doesn't know if anyone else in his patrol is alive or dead. His only chance for survival is to walk across the desert and cross into Syria. It was supposed to be a straightforward mission. During build-up to the ground invasion of Iraq, B Squadron of the 22nd SAS is stationed at a forward operating base in Al Juf, Saudi Arabia. 3 8-man patrols, Bravo 10, Bravo 20, and Bravo 30, are to infiltrate deep into Iraqi territory on intelligence-gathering missions. The main task of Bravo 2 is to find a good lying-up position and set up an observation post to monitor the main supply route, or MSR, that runs between the town of Hakka and 3 airfields. It's thought that the Iraqi army is moving Scud missile launchers along this route. The patrol is to report on enemy movements via radio or SATCOM. After 10 days, a chopper will resupply them or move them to a new location. Bravo 2 consists of Patrol Commander Sergeant Andy McNabb, Sergeant Vince Phillips, Corporal Chris Ryan, Lance Corporal Dinger Pring, troops Bob Concilio, Legs Lane, Stan McGowan, and Mark Cober. On the night of January 22nd, an RAF Chinook drops the soldiers into the Iraqi desert. Unlike the other 2 patrols, Bravo 2 opts to travel on foot instead of bringing vehicles. It's a decision they'll soon regret. The mission gets off to a rough start. The desert's colder than expected. It's hard work moving their heavy equipment. They've misjudged the terrain from 4 outdated maps. Bravo 2 soon realizes that the spot they're in is hot. There's an anti-aircraft encampment less than a quarter of a mile away. Legs, the patrol's radio man, has trouble contacting command on the radio. The day after their insertion, Bravo 2 is compromised when a young goat herder stumbles upon them and then alerts other people. In the afternoon, the patrol finds themselves hunkered down in a wadi, or a dry river channel. From about 219 yards away on a bluff, 2 Iraqi men watch them. It's a tense moment, and then Chris makes a bad mistake. He waves. It's meant to be a disarming gesture, but he waves with his left hand, which is offensive in Arab culture. The men instantly begin firing their weapons. Bravo 2 returns fire and the situation rapidly deteriorates. The Iraqis are quickly joined by a dump truck full of men with AK-47s. As the firefight rages on, patrol retreats further down the riverbed, struggling under the weight of their heavy haversacks while shooting and trying to evade getting shot. Chris activates his Tactical Rescue Beacon, or TACB, and yells that they're under attack. Andy also activates his TACB. Though their beacons are set to different frequencies to alert both the US and SAS forces, neither gets a response. Bravo 2 ditches their biggest packs so they move faster. Legs leaves behind radio equipment. At the last minute, Chris runs almost 20 yards back to get a hip flask his wife had given him as a present out of his discarded pack. Miraculously, the patrol escapes the Iraqi fighters. They regroup some distance away. Amazingly, no one had been hit, but they lost a lot of their gear. Not sure if their communications had gone through, they decide not to wait for a rescue to show up and head for the Syrian border. As dusk falls, Bravo 2 detours and doubles back through the rough rocky terrain in case they're being followed. Then they walk south. Periodically, Mark switches on his GPS to get a fix on the satellite. They then check their maps to determine which way to go. After walking for several hours, Stan collapses. He has on thermal underwear and the fast pace has caused him to sweat hard. He's dehydrated. Chris, who's trained as a medic, gives him rehydrate powder mixed into water. Some of the others want to find a safe hiding spot and leave Stan behind, but Chris won't allow it. He cajoles and threatens the semi-conscious Stan into continuing to walk. When they venture near the MSR, fearing discovery, Chris sets an even more punishing walking pace. Stan and Vince keep up with the rest of them. After about an hour, they paused to consult which way to go and discovered that the rest of the patrol, Andy, Bob, Mark, Legs, and Dinger, are missing. From higher ground, they pause to look out over the desert floor, but don't see the missing soldiers. Chris turns on his tac beam, and to see if by chance Andy has his on, they'd be able to communicate. Unfortunately, there's no answer. The patrol is down to 3 soldiers. Chris, Stan, and Vince walk on, occasionally trying to contact Andy on the tac beam. At around 5 a.m., having hiked some 43 miles through the night, they take shelter in a ditch. They take turns sleeping and keeping watch. As the day wears on, it grows colder and begins to snow. After resting, Stan seems better. Chris's feet are beginning to grow blisters due to his rough wool socks. The 3 snuggle together in the muddy, snowy ditch until dark. At night, they set out, trying to navigate toward the border via compass. They walk for hours in the freezing cold. Vince gets belligerent.
Alright, hold on. I'm gonna have to stop here. Sorry, guys. Like, comment, subscribe if you're into it.